Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and also good evening for some of you. Welcome to this launch of a new book by one of my colleagues at S. Rajaratnam School of International Study, Dr. Benjamin Ho. Before we listen to Benjamin, maybe let me say a few words regarding his latest project. One of the most important questions that we have faced from political scientists and policy makers today is, what would the rise of China mean for the rest of the world? Let me say that again. What would the rise of China mean for the rest of the world? Indeed, what happens in China and what happens to China is closely watched by people all over, from economists to businesses to politicians and professional scholars, of whom Benjamin, the author of the book today, is one of. Assistant Professor Benjamin Ho is a member of RSIS China program. Today, I am happy to recommend his book entitled China's Political Worldview and Chinese Exceptionalism, International Order and Global Leadership to all of you. Benjamin's book addresses one fundamental question in the existing literature about China today. That is there anything unique about China's view of itself? And if so, how is this being reflected in the way China sees and engages with the world? To answer this question, Benjamin takes the argument that China perceives itself as being exceptional. That is, it is good and it is different. Such a perception has influenced China's approach to the practice of international politics. By analyzing China's political worldview, Benjamin argues that China and its exceptionalism in the last decade or so has pervaded Chinese thinking to international politics, and that Chinese policymakers consider China to be good and better than the West, not only in its model of international relations, but increasingly so also in the field of domestic governance. Indeed, if we look at China's response to the coronavirus pandemic and what Chinese leaders are saying today, China seems to be pushing the narrative that it has dealt with the coronavirus much better than many Western countries, especially in comparison to the United States of America. Benjamin's book deals with a number of topics that will be of interest to both IR scholars, international relations scholars, as well as policymakers and general observers of China. In his book, he covers themes such as China's theories of international relations, China's image promotion efforts, China's engagement with the modern world, the Belt and Road Initiative, and also China's relations with Southeast Asia, including case studies on Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore. By relating the above discussions to China's political worldview and claims to exceptionalism, Benjamin offers us textured insights into Chinese political behavior, as well as China's preferences concerning international order and global leadership. As the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew pointed out a decade ago. China wants to be China and to be respected as such, not as an honorary member of the West. The Chinese will want to share the 21st century as a co-equal with the United States of America. It is with this basic assumption that Benjamin takes in his development of the ideas in his book. Whether we agree with Benjamin's argument or not, China's global presence cannot be ignored, and its challenges to the present international order cannot be simply wished away. With these brief words, I am now happy to pass the screen over to Assistant Professor Benjamin Ho. Over to you, Benjamin.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador Ong. Is this screen visible?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Ong, once again. The 17th century French philosopher Blaise Pascal once said that authors should speak of our book rather than my book, as there is usually more of other people's work in it rather than their own. And being the author of this book, this is certainly true. I'm very aware that a lot of ideas in this book are owed not just to myself, but to many people around, including my friends and colleagues, discussants, Tiang, Boon, and Mingjiang, as well as people in RSIS, people outside of RSIS, and certainly my own circle of friends and family members. So I think that's important to recognize, because even in the discussion of China's political worldview, and in this book, as I discussed, you realize that many of these ideas that I try and develop are not entirely unique, which is interesting given that this book is about discussing the uniqueness of China. Certainly the ideas of this book are not unique, and if you're interested, you will realize that a lot of references have been made both to scholars in the West as well as scholars from China and the Asia Pacific. So as Ambassador Ong has earlier highlighted, the main idea of this book that I'm trying to put forth is that China perceives itself as being exceptional, that is good and different. And such a perception, or one could say a mindset, has influenced its approach and its practice of international relations. And to break this down further, I would make the argument that the key driver to understand Chinese international politics, my contention is that the key driver behind China's international politics is the sense of exceptionalism within the Chinese Communist Party. So before I talk briefly about my book, I thought it's important to highlight this idea of exceptionalism and why is it relevant to our thinking about international politics. And this is precisely the same question that my Viva examiner asked me. So that's the first question the examiner asked, and it's probably the first question many of us here will ask. What's so exceptional about exceptionalism that you have to write something about it? The idea is that don't all countries consider themselves exceptional? Certainly, the terms exceptionalism has been bandied around. Definitely in America, and even in Singapore, and countries around all over tend to think of themselves as exceptional. So if that's the case, then as the argument goes, if all countries view themselves as exceptional, then no country is exceptional. That is true to some extent, but I just want us to dig a bit deeper. And I think this is where my logic, I hope to develop this logic, is that unless we are prepared to argue that all countries consider themselves exceptional in the same way, otherwise the differences that constitute the reasons for their self-perceived exceptionalism have to be accounted for. So in other words, different countries consider themselves exceptional. Of course, whether we agree or not is a different thing, but different countries consider themselves exceptional for different reasons. And in this book, I try and develop the idea of exceptionalism as a means of fostering national identity, the idea of we are unique, and therefore this is who we are. And also, more specifically for our discussion, the framing of its international politics. In other words, what should we do? So the big question here, and I think many of us would be interested in asking, is China really exceptional? And that is really the idea behind this book, and which I've developed over the last 5 years in the course of my studies. In my view, at least, and of course we can disagree, in my view, its leaders and public intellectuals really think so and try to act so. In other words, exceptionalism is not a game of bluff. It's not something that Chinese leaders think otherwise and they sort of use that as a rhetoric. I do think, and this can be seen in my theoretical developments, certainly you can sense some of my theoretical persuasions. I do think that its leaders and public intellectuals think and believe that it is exceptional, it is different. However, and I think this is the real challenge behind the study of exceptionalism, that China also needs to take the world as it is and not as what it wants or what it thinks the world ought to be. That's a big challenge right now, and this is where a lot of the tensions between China, the United States, and the West comes into sharp relief, because clearly the Chinese do not think the world is what it is ought to be. They have their own preference, their own norms. They view the world as inherently framed by Western perception and very much created for Western countries to continue their dominance or hegemony. My colleague Tiang Boon has already written a book on the responsibilities of a great power, and I want to develop that idea also in recognizing that it is not just about saying what we want in the case of China, but to also recognize what others want. And I think that's really part of what it means to be a great power, and to find some kind of working compromise. I normally use this analogy when I talk about exceptionalism. I have 4 kids at home, so one could say I'm acquainted at least with the kind of thinking. You know, when someone is a young child, a baby, an infant, a toddler, he or she has a unique way of viewing the world, which adults may or may not agree, but you grant it to them, given that they are small, they are not yet mature, they have a way of viewing the world which may be quite different from how adults. I mean, an excellent example, if you see a 2-year-old kid wearing his diapers and just walking around, you would think that it's cute, it's okay. But if imagine a grown-up man doing exactly the same thing, he will be arrested for sure. So I think my point in this analogy is that China has now moved from a child to an adult. You know, it has developed far beyond the early stages of development. And the challenge is that it cannot always insist on its own unique way of seeing the world. Familiar with the idea of something with Chinese characteristics. So socialism with Chinese characteristics, all sorts of stuff. You just tag on the term Chinese characteristics, and therein lies the sense that China has a claim to what it sees as its worldview as being different from the West, and that is legitimate because it is part of Chinese culture, it is part of what Chinese people, Chinese tradition has. But it's a challenge nonetheless that given the need to engage and relate with the world, there is a need to find some kind of working compromise, especially if we are talking about China as having or wanting to pursue the responsibilities of a great power. So that's just the introduction, and these are the chapters in the book, as Ambassador Ong has already highlighted. I certainly will not go through chapter by chapter, but except to say these are, and the reason why these chapters are being developed, and this is just something about the book, it is not so much written in a chronological order. What I do in the book, what I attempt to do in the book, is to focus on key themes and topics, at least to me, that I view as relevant to China's international relations and how they reflect Chinese exceptionalism thinking or otherwise. So in the book, I discuss international relations theories developed by Chinese IR scholars over the years. I talk about China's national identity, which is something I would say it's a big issue right now, who exactly China is. China's national image and claims to global leadership. Interestingly, President Xi a couple of weeks ago made a in a party meeting talk about the need to improve China's national image, and certainly the very well-known Belt and Road Initiative, and of course I did in the course of developing this book, managed to speak to scholars, policymakers in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore, and I try and include their perspectives and interpretation of China's exceptionalism in this book. To what extent do these countries think that China is exceptional? And the final chapter, the original book was written without the final chapter, but given that the coronavirus outbreak started shortly after this book was completed, I told the editors that I would like to include an additional chapter on China, the coronavirus, and China's exceptionalism, how the coronavirus challenges what China has done and how these actions of China reflects exceptionalist thinking in its response. So areas for further study, I'm sure this is definitely not the last word we will have on China. There'll be many more books written, and this represents a modest contribution to what is already out there and what is going to be written in the coming years. I argue that the following topics, namely China's national identity and its engagement with the modern world, needs to be looked at closely. And this is where, as a political scientist, as IR scholars, our blind spots is that we may not recognize that other areas, other social sciences discipline may have also very important insights into Chinese domestic life, which unfortunately IR scholars don't always pay a lot of attention to. So there is a need to blend these insights to have a more comprehensive understanding of China. The idea of the issue of leadership personalities, certainly of President Xi and some of his closest advisors, need to be in mind for further clues as to how they affect and influence China's political behavior. And last but not least, Chinese information operations and China's modes of political influence, how and to what extent Chinese information operations have sought to discredit the West, because I think this is one very key element of Chinese exceptionalism, the idea that we are different from you and how the Chinese want to portray themselves as being not just different, but more importantly, better than the West. I conclude my book with actually a discussion of themes in this movie, Ip Man 4. Reason I included that was because I watched this movie, by the way, so it's an excuse to watch movies with my kids and also to do some writing. Sometime last year in the course of the coronavirus pandemic. And I felt this movie deals with some very interesting ideas, which may have some relevance to what we're discussing. The idea of civilizational differences between China and the West. The story of this movie tells the story of Ip Man, who goes over to America to find a better future for his son. But when he reaches America, he realizes, despite the country as being a place of promise, there are also many negative habits, including discrimination, which all of us are quite familiar, unfortunately, over the course of the past year, where we see aspects of discrimination against Asians in America. However, at the same time, what this movie does is not so much to only portray the West in a negative light, but also to highlight Chinese social life as having its own fundamental fault lines. So I think that's something that resonated with me. It's not about criticizing the West itself, but also in the process of criticizing the West, this movie also highlights some of the fundamental problems within Chinese tradition and Chinese society. The idea, for instance, that Chinese Kung Fu is only for Chinese and cannot be transmitted and cannot be taught to the West. So my conclusion, and I'll pass on the time to discussants, is that number one, social and cultural identity are crucial elements of a country's worldview, political worldview, and claims to exceptionalism. As the movie Ip Man has highlighted, identities are also not inherently fixed and cannot be changed. They can change. And also that politics does not have the final say. It's interesting I say that, given that we are in the field of international relations, but if we take a broad view of social life and what happens in China, it is not always the case that politics have the final say, and political parties may not always have the final word. Some things happen outside of what politicians, policymakers, statesmen are able, beyond the control of them. And my last word is that China's future story and a story that the CCP wants to tell about China may not always be one and the same. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'll pass the time over back to Ambassador Ong.
Thank you, Benjamin. Benjamin has given us a bit of the content of his book. Today we are happy to have two discussants joining us to talk a bit more about the topic and to help us unpack some of the issues which Benjamin has covered in his book. First, we have Assistant Professor Tiang Boon. Tiang Boon is the coordinator of China program in the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies in the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, we call RSIS, here at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. The other discussant is Associate Professor Mingjiang. Mingjiang is what we call the Provost Chair in International Relations. But more importantly, he is the coordinator of the PhD program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies here at NTU. I'm sure both of you will be able to add to what Benjamin had just illuminated. But more importantly, we expect our audience to also participate in the discussion after your presentation. So let us try to keep to time. We shall start with Professor Tiang Boon. Over to you, Tiang Boon.
Right. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ong. First of all, I'd like to start by congratulating my good friend, Dr. Benjamin Ho, on his new book on Chinese exceptionalism. It is a book on Chinese exceptionalism, but I like to state first and foremost that it is an exceptional book. I'm not meaning that as a pun. I mean that literally, right? And why? I will explain why as I go on. And I think it's important to have this book. There's a lot of books on China, and part of this discourse, in my view, is dominated, especially in the English language, by Americans. And at the same time, you have Chinese providing their own interpretation of their country's view. I think there is space, in particular for what I call a non-American and a non-Chinese perspective coming in, interpret how China thinks. And here, this is, one of Dr. Benjamin Ho's contribution. And not only that, I would like to suggest that this book make at least three major contributions. First, I think, as far as I understand, it is the first major work on Chinese exceptionalism. Of course, there's a first major book, in fact. There are a few other writings. People like Zhang Feng has full-length articles on Chinese exceptionalism. But in terms of a book, a very in-depth study on this phenomena, the worldview of how this exceptionalism is being interpreted by the Chinese themselves, the debate behind the scenes. I would say that, as far as I understand it, this is the first major work on in that regard, and I think Dr. Benjamin Ho should be credited for that major contribution to the literature, right? And I think, although this book itself tries to unpack the Chinese worldview and also tries to relate that exceptionalist worldview to its identity, it can also help us try to illuminate and better understand Chinese behavior, in particular during the time of President Xi Jinping. There is a chapter devoted to the Belt Road Initiative, which I thought is a very good manifestation in a physical, actual policy manifestation of the Chinese exceptionalist worldview, right? Of how, and the one thing about the Belt Road Initiative is that, regardless of what kind of maps, all the roads that you see, they all link to one center, and that center, if you will, is China. All the roads, all the paths of the BRI lead to one center, and that center is China, right? And that itself gives this sense of a policy economic statecraft centered on a exceptionalist worldview, right? And I think another major contribution, and that goes with chapter 7, which I've read with great interest, is how that chapter devotes to a unpacking of Singapore-China relations, but from the viewpoint of the Chinese exceptionalist view, and how that could sometimes create certain, I won't use the word misunderstandings, but different perceptions between, the Chinese and some of the Singaporean elites, right? So that I thought that particular chapter was really good in terms of using the lens of exceptionalism to try to explain a certain facet of the relationship between Singapore and China, right? And so I would briefly conclude before asking my 2 quick questions to Ben, is that I strongly urge everyone to get the book if you can. So, and I guarantee you won't regret it, right? My 2 quick questions is that, and I think you, Ben, I think you briefly highlighted it in your first slide where you talk about, where you take the position that, exceptionalism could be differences in the way, although every country would see themselves as exceptional, but exceptionalism could be understood as a way in which, how countries differentiate in terms of understanding themselves and of course the world, right? So this leads me to the other country who likes to see itself as exceptional, which is the US, right? Everybody knows that the US, analyzes itself as the shining city upon a hill, a beacon of democracy, and so on and so forth. So how would we reconcile American exceptionalism and Chinese exceptionalism? Would this actually be a conflict point? Because scholars have talked about differing political systems, lack of mutual distrust, US-China trading disputes, struggle for power. All these are very conventional explanations. But what about an exceptionalist explanation? So in relation to US in particular, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And my second question would be that, and in regards to the US, could we say that Chinese views of exceptionalism is actually sort of a defensive form, a reactive form, right? For example, I give an example of China would say that we are special. We have Chinese democracy, Chinese socialist system with Chinese characteristics. So the reason why we cannot adopt American democracy or liberal democracy is because we are we're exceptional. Basically, we have to choose certain kinds of political system that fit our unique history, our unique circumstances, and so on and so forth. So would you say that Chinese exceptionalism can also be conceived as a form of defensive nationalism, as sort of a reaction against attempts to make China more like the US? But so with this exceptionalist argument, China could say that we're not going down the path of the US because we are exceptional, we are unique, we are different, and of course good as well, as you put it. So I leave it as that. Maybe I hand on now to Professor Mingjiang, who would like to add his comments.
Well, thank you very much, Tiang, Boon. Good afternoon, Ambassador Hong. Good afternoon, Ben. Also, I would like to join Tiang Boon in congratulating Ben for completing this book and publishing this book. This is really a very useful addition and a great contribution to our understanding the studies of Chinese foreign policy and China's international policy. And it's really a fabulous read. I also agree with a lot of the positive assessments that Tiang Boon just shared. This is indeed a very new subject, and we're very happy that Ben has now taken the lead to study a niche area in Chinese politics and China's foreign policy. And I hope this book will help enlighten a lot of us who are involved in studying China, especially Chinese foreign policy. Well, I won't repeat a lot of the good things about the book, but let me just try to kickstart the discussion, and perhaps by raising a few points. Some will be comments, some will be questions. So first issue, I think, although the book really does not fully address, but I think it's a very important issue or question. The question is, where does exceptionalism come from, right? On surface, I think a lot of people will just say it's about psychology, right? Every one of us believes that I'm good, I'm different, right? He will also say, oh, he's good, he's different. So could there be a psychological sort of factor behind all these beliefs in exceptionalism, including the case of China? So that's one. And reading some of the chapters, I get the sense that you are also trying to refer to the impact of domestic politics in China, how domestic politics, right, have helped shape some of the rhetoric in China's foreign policy narratives, right, its positions, principles, and its perception of itself and the views of the outside world. So domestic politics could be a reason, a factor. And history, as you rightly pointed out, right, the history also plays a role, especially in the Chinese notion of century of humiliation, all that. We can perhaps also look at some of the actual, relationships and political interactions between China and its key foreign affairs counterparts, especially the U.S. and some Western countries, neighboring countries, right? So perhaps this, actual practice of relationships and all these interactions may have helped China's self-perception and its worldview as well. But these are, I think, probably not really very contentious. I think a lot of us can agree that, if we wanted to find the sources or origins of exceptionalism, these factors, these things are perhaps important. But I wanted to focus on one issue which was absent in your book and also absent in your presentation. That is the issue of expediency, right? Policy tool. I wonder to what extent nation states, including China, sometimes claim that they're good, they're different, they're exceptional because of the purposes of pursuit of expediency, using these things and these claims as convenient political tools or policy tools. I'll give one example, for instance, human rights, right? We know, China's official human rights policy tries to emphasize social economic rights, okay, and tries to downplay civil political rights. Well, this has been the case, right, in the past decade, since 1949, I would say. But if you remember, I think some people probably remember, last year, a former U.S. national security senior official, Pottinger, made a public speech on the occasion of commemorating the May 4th movement. He made a very interesting observation. He said in his speech that, when the United Nations was first created, when the member states got together to discuss some of the UN human rights documents, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for instance. You know what? The Chinese official, the Chinese representative who took part in the discussion was all for universality, all for emphasis on civil political rights. And that was during the Republic of China era. So, I'm just giving one example just to, further stimulate thoughts here. So whether when people, say that they are unique, exceptional, and good or better or different, to what extent it's about expediency, right? It's about covering other rationales, other concerns, et cetera, et cetera. That's one. Now, second, when we talk about Chinese exceptionalism, I wonder if you can say some more words about the substance of Chinese exceptionalism. We heard from you and read from your book that your main argument is that China believes that it is different and it is good. Right? It has this positive perception of self. When we read things about American exceptionalism, those authors can come up with some substantive things to say. Right? For instance, one of the things that Boon just shared, right? American own claim that the U.S. is a better political system, is a champion of democracy, human rights, etc. Right? City on the hill, all that sort of thing. So in the case of China, in addition to your observation that China claims itself to be good and different, what are the particular things, more concrete things that we can observe under the rubric of Chinese exceptionalism? Last, Ben, you don't have to answer this, but let me just try to challenge. And I guess this question will probably be an interesting one among participants this afternoon here. Now, we know for over 10 years, China has been assertive in the South China Sea disputes, right? Okay. Now, how do we understand China's assertiveness from the particular perspective of Chinese exceptionalism? So if you could share some brief comments on the last question, that'd be really wonderful. Thank you very much. Now, return back to you, Ambassador Ong.
Thank you, Mingjiang. I think there are many questions posed by different participants. Yeah. I think maybe I should let Benjamin respond to what the two discussants have posed to you first before we open the floor to the rest of the participants. How about that?
Okay. Thanks, EDC. Yeah, sure. The last time I was asked questions by two professors was during my Viva. So that's an interesting experience to be experienced all over again. But anyway, those are very important questions, and I think looking at the Q&A, some of these questions are actually reflected in the Q&A. And I think the first question that Tiang Boon posed on how do you reconcile American exceptionalism and Chinese exceptionalism is an excellent one. My quick answer to that is that if both the Americans and China both insist on the views of their exceptionalism and to insist that these aspects of their views are carried to the logical conclusion, then conflict is likely to happen. So in other words, if Americans stay faithful to American exceptionalism and China stays faithful to its own view of Chinese exceptionalism, in which I will talk a bit later about what these characteristics might be, then and they carry it to this logical conclusion, then conflict will happen. Thankfully, or otherwise, policymakers are not always entirely consistent with what they think. And therein lies the possibility of some form of meeting somewhere in the middle, either by design or by accident. So I would say that if you look at the grand views of American exceptionalism, and I think this is really the real idea that behind American exceptionalism, that America wants to be number one. I think a number of scholars have already pointed out that if America insists on being number one, and China insists on overtaking the Americans as number one, as what late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew highlighted, or at least co-share the world as number one, then there can be only one number one. Fortunately, as we have seen in the recent Olympics, people can agree to share the gold medal. So I think but whether countries can do the same, it's really something that they would have to decide whether it is in their own interest to share that gold medal, so to speak. So I think that's really a case of whether America and China are willing to accept one another as number ones. Okay, so that's the point. Second question by Tiang Boon, and I think that's an excellent question of whether China's view of exceptionalism is a defensive form of nationalism. I think I understand your point. And is it a form of reaction? I think the challenge with China, and I use this analogy to some of us who understand this analogy, it's almost like David becoming Goliath. The underdog now becomes this towering 8-foot giant, and therefore lies the problem. Really, scholars would say it doesn't matter what Chinese intentions are. The fact that you are big, you are influential, would automatically create some form of anxiety, and bigger powers it's the responsibility in the sense for bigger powers to reassure smaller countries, smaller powers that they are not. So I think that the one could say that whether it's a form of defensive nationalism or not, that's not how countries outside see China. And China will have to find some ways to communicate that form of which it sees itself as defensive to other countries who would view it as offensive. So that's something is unfortunately a structural issue. On Mingjiang's question, the first question on where does exceptionalism comes from, is it psychology? That's precisely what I did in my pre-PhD journey. In fact, this analysis of exceptionalism, it's almost 8 years ever since I wrote a draft paper for an RSIS working series. So where did this idea of exceptionalism come from? It's hard to pinpoint the roots, simply because Chinese scholars, and you won't find the idea of exceptionalism in Chinese is called 特殊论 or 例外论. You won't find it being used by Chinese leaders, unlike American leaders, policymakers who are much more generous with calling America great and terms like that. Chinese leaders, policymakers tend to be a bit more guarded in how they describe China to be. However, just because that word does not exist in political discourse and speech does not mean that the meaning is entirely vacuous. So if you look at that, the idea of exceptionalism, there are scholars in the field of philosophy, and this is where I think as IRA scholars, the fact that we don't look into other fields of social sciences. In the field of philosophy, for instance, one of the earlier sources of the idea of exceptionalism I trace is by this Chinese philosopher Keng when he talks about the idea of Chinese being different. And if you move back further in history, in the 80s, you have got sociologists like Fei Xiaotong, who talks about China as being different and how these differences in their own domestic life and the way the Chinese perceive how Chinese society is being organized actually is subsequently being reflected in the way Chinese international politics is played out. So I would say it's not entirely an individual psychological issue. I think there are existing studies on it, except that it's not in the field of international politics. The impact of domestic politics, and I think I take your point on whether is exceptionalism used simply as a way of expediting or for expediency, and how should we view it? And certainly the point that was made that is it purely used as a strategic tool to gain some kind of political advantage? I will not rule that out. As diplomats, policymakers, we make use of whatever tools we have at our disposal to explain something. But I think what I try and do in this, but just because they are tools that are being used does not mean that they are devoid of meaning entirely. And this is where, well, one could say my sympathies with the constructivist school, if one would call it, will be clear that these tools do have meanings being embedded into it. So, and I think that goes to your final question, your question of substance of Chinese exceptionalism. What exactly is it? In my book, I sort of use it as it's an interwoven stable of ideas which makes China the way it is. In other words, the idea of China is very much built into Chinese exceptionalism. What are these characteristics? The short answer, and if you're studying China right now from the vantage point, it is the leadership of the CCP. That is that's the most fundamental, foundational characteristics of Chinese exceptionalism, and one that the Chinese Communist Party, at least for the last decade or so, or even further on, even if you move back further down in history, has always been trying to emphasize that without the CCP, there will be no China, that the CCP is the ultimate final defender of China and what China is all about. So that would be a very important that's an important starting point. We can certainly talk about the Chinese use of history, whether that 5,000 years of history, ideas of century of national humiliation, all these narratives that are built into the idea of Chinese exceptionalism. And more recently, in recent years, certainly, Chinese exceptionalism would highlight the fact that we are not with the West, and in fact, we are better than the West. And this is an idea that is starting to become more pervasive, especially in the field of domestic governance, where we see China not just wanting to emulate the West, but trying to say that this is what we do. For instance, the idea of non-interference into other countries, that we are not going to tell you what you're going to do. It's almost seem as a thinking that makes China superior. They point to the West as constantly encroaching into other countries' affairs and say, well, we are not the West, we don't do that. But whether that is true in reality or not is a different question. And your final point on how do we sort of understand China's South China Sea claims from a Chinese exceptionalism perspective? My answer is that there is very little exceptionalism in that sense contained there. I recall one scholar from a Southeast Asian country who says, don't just look at what China says, look at what it does. And I think that is really the issue, because in the case of South China Sea, another way to see it is that basically this belongs to us. Chinese exceptionalism would make the claim, or at least the Chinese would think, that this whole South China Sea, we have got historical rights to it. And this emphasis on history, as we see, is something that the Chinese constantly refer to in its territorial claims. And this reference to history represents a very important aspect of Chinese exceptionalism, because the Chinese would argue that if not for the West coming into China, disrupting the way of life in China and Southeast Asia, the region would be peaceful. And therefore they point to the United States as basically the disturber of peace in the region. So with that, thank you for those two questions and for reminding me of my PhD experience once again. So back to you, Ambassador.
Well, very good. Thank you, Benjamin. You know, I was just listening to you and what Mingjiang has posed in his questions. The thing that come to my mind is Chinese exceptionalism. Is it Chinese exceptionalism or CCP exceptionalism? Yeah, and I wonder whether among the Chinese population there is such a distinction. I suppose in Chinese population, the Chinese population in China, it will be Chinese exceptionalism rather than CCP exceptionalism. Whereas for people of Chinese background living outside China, there could be a trend of thought that say that it is not so much Chinese exceptionalism, but the exceptionalism promoted by the Chinese Communist leadership to serve whatever strategic objectives or other kind of goals and aims which the Chinese government has in reaching out to China's place in the world today. So, yeah, Mingjiang, you just bear that in mind. Maybe at the later part of this, in the later part of this Q&A, maybe you can offer some comments on that particular aspect. There are many other questions. Ben, I think you can see some of them already overlapping one another. Is there a particular burning question that you need to reply? There are more than 20 questions now. I think some of them have really overlapped.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions. I think maybe Ambassador Ong, why not you pick? whichever interests you.
Okay, I think there is a lot of discussion on why others should be allowed to articulate what China ought to be, yet do not allow China to articulate what the world ought to be.
Okay.
How you will respond to this particular?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and I think that's one of the more philosophical questions, not so much linked to policy per se, but really whether why is the world insisting that China ought to why is the world speaking on behalf on China and not allowing China to say what the world ought to be? It's a very difficult question to answer, and this, in my view, goes to the heart of this whole dynamic between what is universal and what is particular or peculiar. What is common to all, universal ideas where all countries ought to oblige and to obey, and what is peculiar and which countries can say this is how I view the world and this is what I ought to insist about how my view of the world ought to be like. My short answer to that is that right now, if you come from a point of perspective of power politics, the answer is actually very simple. The Marxists or Chinese some of them would say that because China is weak, therefore the world has set the rules, and therefore the world is trying to impose these rules. And in order for us to reinterpret or have a new set of rules, we need to be number one. So that the idea, at least according to this train of thought, is that basically if you are strong and powerful, you set the rules, and the weaker parties would follow. And that is where we can see a lot of these power politics play being fleshed out in how in Chinese preferences, not just in the region, but even in the United Nations. And recently there's been an article published in International Affairs, which talks about Chinese preferences in the United Nations and how Chinese voting patterns in the United Nations actually reflect Chinese ways of thinking. So we are starting to see Chinese articulation of how the world ought to be. But certainly, and this is where my earlier point about American exceptionalism comes into play. If America decides to take the idea of exceptionalism to its logical conclusion and to prevent China from overtaking it, then clearly it will not allow China to articulate what the world ought to be. And I think the best example we see in this would be the recent, in January, this WHO mission to Wuhan, where it is a case of China dictating the terms of the investigations. And subsequently, the Americans, as we all know, they are, and maybe other Western countries are unhappy because they feel that these investigations were not sufficiently open and transparent. But think about it. I mean, I can understand if someone were to go into your house, would you allow him or her to just go into your house and investigate any old how? I mean, in Singapore, just 2 days ago, we had a case where you've got some of these security officials going into somebody's house and checking whether there have been social distancing problems. So you can see where the Chinese is coming from. There is a deep sense of mistrust, suspicion towards the West. And therefore, China does not want the West to sort of just come in and slip and to play in China, so to speak, according to Western rules. It has to be according to China's rules. So the short answer to that is that China is certainly, it certainly wants to articulate what the world ought to be under its own terms. The question is whether are these terms sufficiently universal, or one would say generous or broad, so other countries, other than a few countries, so that the majority of the international community would be able to buy in and agree on. And I think that's China's biggest challenge, to convince not just a few countries, but the majority of the international community that these rules, references, norms are actually in their interest. So I'll leave it. Thank you. Yeah.
I think Rafiq Jumaboy has this question here, which deserves some attention. Yeah. Towards the end of the Q&A, where he basically noted that the relevance of exceptionalism is basically underpinned by economic power, right? So the question now is, what is China doing? The Chinese side seems to be dismantling the basis of that economic power. Yeah. How does that undermine, quote unquote, your argument that there's a need for China to share power? So I suppose it's a zero-sum game, right? Yeah. I don't believe in sharing power. I just want to be articulating myself as exceptional, and I am the one who will be the number one. Yeah. How do you see this, Ben?
Oh, excellent question. For a long time, and certainly following the 2008-2009 financial crisis, China's greatest claim to being a big power, it is economy. Basically, the claim that because our economy is double-digit growth for many years, more than 2 decades, that was China's greatest evidence, and also the CCP's greatest evidence that it says we have been doing well. This is the proof of the pudding, and it is seen in Chinese economic growth. And the interesting thing is that a lot of its economic growth has also been underpinned by, well, one might say, in recent years even, because of China's fintech and some of these big technology companies. In fact, that was China's greatest claim to almost, one might say, parity with the United States, because some of its tech giants were its leading forerunners of China's influence and projection worldwide. But in recent years, we have seen that, and certainly the Jack Ma issue last year might have caused some form of concern, and increasingly also the Chinese Communist Party is starting to take a harder look at some of these tech companies and to see whether the extent to which these tech companies challenge the influence and position of the Chinese Communist Party. So there are Chinese scholars out there who have already been saying that by doing so, China is cutting itself off from the real source of its power, that it ought not to do so. I certainly can't speak and don't speak for the Chinese government. This is something that the Chinese government will have to think very carefully about, whether these access to influence which it has procured through its economic power and also technological power is now being sort of cut prematurely as a result of the concern that these institutions pose a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. On your question of whether China is actively dismantling that through digitization, I'm not familiar with this area, but I think the way I see it, at least, is that China, and certainly for Southeast Asia, is that China sees Southeast Asia and the region where it sees a threat from the Americans, and it wants the Americans to be effectively out of Southeast Asia. It wants to stake its position in Southeast Asia, and that is not just for political reasons, but also for military reasons. Because of the fact that Southeast Asia represents American forward presence, and therefore that forward presence reflects a threat to China's own territorial integrity. So I think that there is that concern as to whether we in Southeast Asia will become vassal states in another unipolar world. I'm not sure whether the situation is so deterministic. I'm sure Southeast Asia countries are finding ways to negotiate great power rivalry and also to negotiate China's actions in the region. So I think there is still some form of agency involved, and it's not a case where China is able to sort of just push its interests through without any form of resistance.
Thank you for that, Ben. Mr. Ho Jin Yong, or Jin Yong Ho as he called himself in the Q&A box, wonder whether it is a case of exceptionalism or a clash of civilization. The competition and the contestation that we are seeing now between China and the United States of America.
Yeah.
How do you see that?
Well, this term I have not seen the term for a long time. It's usually among IRA scholars, a term like that is usually being knocked down very quickly, especially if you try and use this term in America. But increasingly, even though people try not to associate themselves with clash of civilization because it is too simplistic, but it would seem that in terms of the thinking, Samuel Huntington might be on to something, even though he wrote this 30 years ago with a very different context. So I would say that even if we call it a clash of civilizations, I mean, the idea of exceptionalism is certainly linked to a country's mindset, and whether you call it a civilizational mindset or a cultural mindset, it's a mindset thing. And as I was saying earlier, if indeed such a mindset is being taken to its logical conclusion by both the Americans and the Chinese, then an inevitable clash will happen, because there is no way to square the circle, so to speak. Fortunately, and for most of us, policymakers and leaders don't often go that far. There are other constraints they will have to face. For instance, in the case of China, there might be bureaucratic constraints already on the Chinese Communist Party. The recent outbreak of the coronavirus in the past week in China might sort of affect some of these expressions of confidence and the fact that we are better than the West. So it really remains to be seen. All I can say is that fortunately for most of us, these ideas are not often logically practiced to their conclusion.
I think we should let you have a little pause there. Maybe I can ask our Professor Mingjiang, our Sige, to the two other younger fellow. How about, looking at this idea of exceptionalism? It's basically everybody saying that they are exceptional, but underlying all that is that they are competing one another, right? It's a zero-sum game. Yeah. How do you see this going forward? I mean, if you carry on everybody showing off their exceptional quality, then you are constantly in a competitive mode. At a certain point, there will be certain outbreak of blunt contestation. Maybe, while we let Ben take a break, Mingjiang, maybe you have a go at this.
Sure, yeah, Ambassador, thank you very much. Well, I agree with a lot of things that Ben has just explained, but I have a particular, a slightly different perspective. I believe, as I said in my first point, I believe that exceptionalism comes from a variety of sources. And I would say domestic politics, indeed, is a very important dimension. Look at it's just one case that you wrote extensively in your book. Coronavirus COVID-19 response, right? We have seen a lot of these differences, disputes, and conflicts between China and some countries, especially U.S. and Western countries, on a lot of these issues that are relevant to COVID-19, right? The origin, the early stage treatment and policy response, now investigation, and now, all the rhetoric about, whose system is better, right? So let me just perhaps, Ambassador, if you allow me to use 2 or 3 minutes to focus on this particular case, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we all know that in the early month of 2020, when some of the first cases of infection were noted or discovered in Wuhan, right? And the local government certainly responded too slow, and there were actions undertaken by the local government in terms of hiding information, right, blocking information, even suppression of some of the views or voices that emerge in the internet and social media, right? So clearly there was sort of like a response failure in the early stage. And this was actually clearly identified and recognized in the Chinese society even the Chinese media during those times. But you know what happened? Towards the second half of 2020 and 2021, all this month now, you don't see any mentioning of that early stage failure, policy failure, in Chinese media, in Chinese, government documents or leadership statements. Rather now, the official position is that there's nothing wrong in China's response to COVID-19, right? And even if some of the critical views that you see in Western media or whatever seem to be quite objective, but you see a very strong, reaction from China. No, you are just, smearing China. You are, criticizing China. Not from an objective view. You're creating sort of like a negative image of China, etc., etc. Why? Because I think this has to do with domestic politics, right? The party state cannot afford to let basically, the population, society in China say, "Oh, there was a huge mistake," and that mistake has, at least partially contributed to all the disasters we've seen in China, etc. So, so how to understand, from this particular case about, exceptionalism? So again, I would say it has a lot to do with domestic politics, and it has a lot to do with using exceptionalism as a coverage, as an expedient, excuse, or political justification. So that's why I think in the past few months, we've seen this full-fledged media campaign out of China, trying to convince the whole outside world that China has done a fabulous job, China's done better, China's system is superior, etc. I think that's at least partially this the explanation. But of course, there are some facts. In reality, if we understand a lot of the policies, a lot of the measures that China has taken since early last year, indeed, there's a lot of efforts that the government and Chinese people in China have made. And they have so far been quite effective in terms of containing the virus in the Chinese society. But what I'm trying to look at is through the political dimension, the political interactions, the rhetorical sort of stuff that we have observed in the relations between China and many Western countries. So Ambassador Ong, I would say exceptionalism can be very often used as a political expediency.
Yeah, I got your point there. Yeah, expediency and to a certain extent, the competitive dynamics is always embodied in this idea of exceptionalism. Yeah. So Ben, one of the interesting questions which I have overlooked earlier is one of our audience, Wang Limping, asked the differences between the American and the Chinese exceptionalism. Yeah. And is this concept of American exceptionalism strengthened or developed at a time when the rest of the world really did not really bother with what is the impact of being called exceptional? Yeah. So this is connected with earlier questioning also whether the Chinese leadership fully appreciate the content of what is embodied in this exceptionalism concept, and whether this has been now strictly used, as Mingjiang has just explained, for political expediency, for issue which capture the imagination of people in a particular time, or there is actually really a substance in this concept of exceptionalism, and the political leaders are just using it to express in a very direct way why country called China or country called America has to be proud of its special characteristics, and that's why the policy of America or China are different and blah blah blah. So maybe you can provide us a view to wrap up all these different, very intense, deep questions.
Sure, thank you. I think Wang Linpin is one of my MSc students, so that is a very good question, and maybe I'll ask him to answer that in the
yeah, you better watch out. Huh?
Yeah.
I thought you are young, but there are younger people out there who will be cleverer than you very soon.
We have got very good students in our MSc program. Anyway, thanks. I know you made a very interesting point, EDC, on special characteristics, and I think this is what we are trying. What I was trying to drive at, that there are characteristics that are common, but when we talk about exceptionalism, we are trying to look into what are these special characteristics, so to speak. And this is where I would say, and this might be a gross generalization, but the fact is that maybe I should step back and say exceptionalism is something that is very much built into what we understand as national myths, MYTHS. And I use the word myths not in the form of mythical creature, but myths in the sense of the stories and narratives we tell ourselves about our country, about who we are. So whether we agree with American exceptionalism, and I'm sure there are a lot of American scholars, and including Adrian Ang from the US program, who does book on American exceptionalism, where the fact is that manifest destiny and all these things, well, they tend to criticize American exceptionalism. But the way I view it, and this is where the myth of the nation comes in, is that if you look at the stories America tell of themselves, it's usually stories that it's always future oriented. And this is where if you look at elections, American presidents come in on the promise of change towards the future. You don't change the past, you change the future. So that seems to be dominant narratives in the American myth and American story. In Chinese exceptionalism, and certainly we see that in the case of President Xi, it's very much looking back into the past. That means history represents a crucial aspect of how President Xi and at least the story that we are seeing right now emerging from China, it's not so much about a future-oriented telos or eschatology, but rather something that is China's golden age is often referenced vis-a-vis the past as opposed to future. So I would say this is a challenge, because when American leaders come in and campaign on the promise of change, they don't realize that they're actually building on what is happening in the past. In the same way, when Chinese leaders come in and talk about the past, and often it's the glorified past, they don't realize that actually the policies that they have are actually directed towards the future. So I think this is where there has to be some form of acknowledgement of each other's starting points. So my short answer to Linpin is that American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, is often something seen as, well, as the term destiny tells us, it's future-oriented. Whereas in Chinese exceptionalism, the idea is that it's to reclaim the past glories. The question, as many scholars have posed to China, is that which era are you looking to? Which eras of your territorial? In a recent book by Bill Hayton, The Idea of China, he talks about how a lot of these ideas are actually constructed stories. This is not to say the stories are wrong, but we need to recognize the construction of these stories, how they are being constructed, and what are the interests that are being represented in the process of constructing these stories. And finally, to Mingjiang's point, I agree with you. I think domestic politics is a crucial arena for all Chinese leaders, to the extent that foreign policy is often made with reference to domestic politics. So I've no disagreement over that. So the question is, why then the value? What then is the value of exceptionalism? Is it purely a tool? Well, the question, it really raises the question then, even if it's a tool, and even if we view exceptionalism as purely for instrumental use, we need to ask ourselves, it is clearly there is some utility in that instrument, as opposed to just because it is an instrument means it has no utility. So my interest in this project is to highlight the utilitarian view of exceptionalism, how it is used, as opposed to just because it is used, it is of no use. So I think in that sense, the short answer to that is that exceptionalism provides the Chinese leaders, the Communist Party, to state and to stick why its position is actually not just different, but better than the West. And it's ultimately, I would agree with you, about domestic legitimacy. It is about stating why China's ways of governing its own people is inherently better than the West.
So in that respect, Ben, as you mentioned, or earlier on, some of us talk about every big country, big power has its own exceptional quality, and they can classify all these exceptional characteristics as exceptionalism. Is there going to be a chance for different powers with respective exceptionalism to accommodate each other?
That's a $1 million question, Ambassador. So if I think right now what we need to interrogate is what are the content of these ideas, of their sense of greatness. I mean, I suppose it only makes sense of talking about great powers' influence in reference to great powers. Smaller countries, exceptionalism may not be that relevant to bigger countries. So the question,
Singapore will not be exceptional no matter what we do. It doesn't matter whether we are exceptional or not exceptional or just an ordinary Joe, right?
Yeah.
But the big powers, this is important because to them it's a zero-sum kind of a situation. If I concede that this other chap is more exceptional than me, maybe I will minimize my own national identity, or I will lose the support of my own population. Why are we saying that we are not as exceptional or even more exceptional than the other guy?
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer to that. My only quick thoughts to the question that you posed is that big countries, they were to find ways to work with each other while also not isolating their own population. And that is where one may make the case, and certainly I'm not apologies for democracies, but people in the West would say, well, this is the value of democracies because you allow your own population to say something, and therefore you could say that you are responding in response to the wishes and aspirations of your own people. And that has often been used as a critique on China because of its non-democratic system, that the party is basically deciding and you don't let the Chinese people choose. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say if the Chinese people, if given open elections, how would they choose? And whether it would have any relevance in terms of Chinese foreign policy. Maybe it doesn't make a difference, but the democracies would say this is therefore the fundamental difference, that in democracies you can both fulfill your obligations to the world in foreign policy, and also at the same time fulfill your obligations to your own people. So I guess that's where you could say the.
Yeah, Boon, maybe you want to say something about is this characteristic about democracy or being democratic an indispensable definition of being exceptional in the community of nations around the world?
Yeah.
So Russia, for example, can say they are exceptional, more exceptional than America or than China, because look, we are the largest country in the world, and we are on that count alone very exceptional.
Sure.
We may not have the Western, the liberal democracy that the United States of America advocate, but we are exceptional and we are holding together.
Yeah.
So is democracy a necessary precondition for being exceptional in the community or nation?
Yeah. I think EDC, you made a very good point. I think that and therein lies the challenge today, because China looks at the problems in the West and tells its own people, and we've seen that in many of the what is published domestically, highlighting all the problems and flaws of democracies, and essentially using the flaws of democracy to say why the Chinese one-party system is inherently better than the West. So we are seeing a case right now of one might say democracy in crisis, where certainly with regards to the coronavirus pandemic, there seems to be a case where the Chinese are using it to to amplify their own narrative that the ways that we are using is superior to that of the West.
Boon, you have any comments? I give Ben a break.
Right, thank you, Ambassador. My thoughts actually mirror what Mingjiang has mentioned, that there's a strong domestic political element to it. I can cite the example when Deng Xiaoping was in power. Of course, maybe Deng Xiaoping always had this residual thought of China being special and all that, but he didn't say it out. In fact, his style is to, everybody knows, to keep a low profile, try to blend in, integrate into the international community. So that exceptionalist argument, even though they had that thinking, was very much toned down. But a good thing that book for Ben is that he focused on 2013 onwards, which is plenty of evidence of that exceptionalist behavior and thinking, but in particular under Xi Jinping, whom I think to a certain extent that worldview also intertwines with the leadership style of presidency himself, who sees himself as a lot of political scientists argue that he's sort of a transcendent kind of leader, right? And there's rumors going on that he may try for a unprecedented third term, right? So I think there is a degree of linkage with the domestic political elements, and to what extent that exceptionalist character of China manifests itself.
So, in the discussion about exceptionalism, rules and norms that everybody can adhere to, do they play a big role? Yeah. If you talk about exceptional quality being exceptional, the guy that want to be exceptional will tell you, I don't follow the rule, but I can give you all that you want, good economy, good life, security and all that. So where does rules, or where do the rules and norms play in this discussion?
Thanks, EDC. I think that's a very good question. And this is also precisely where the Chinese are, in a sense, criticizing the West for not obeying the rules. Interestingly, even though this, if we agree or we follow this idea of China seeing itself as exceptional, at the same time, it has constantly, at least in rhetoric, insisted that it wants to obey the rules. But in this case, it would often reference the United Nations, the rules of the UN. So this is where, as some scholars have pointed out, one could see China's influence at the UN, and as such, the rules of the UN are seen as being much more acceptable to Chinese preferences. So China is very big on obeying rules, on that rule-abiding, rules-based. But the rules-based that the West talks about, I think it's a bit different from the idea of rules that China has. And I think this is where one of the points of contention. We need to look a bit deeper into how does China and in this case the West, the United States, understand the ideas of the rules-based, whose rules and whose interests are they meant to preserve. The Chinese will look at the United States when they talk about rules-based and say, basically, this is the rule set by the United States to preserve and protect the interests of the United States. And that's a fair criticism. I mean, it's very hard to argue with that logic if one looks at what's happening. At the same time, the Americans will look at China and say, you guys are not obeying the rules of the international system. And the Chinese will deny that. They will say, we are obeying, you are the one that is not obeying. So right now, I think there is a contestation over what these rules are, what they mean substantively, and how they ought to be operationalized in reality.
May I just add on to a point that Ben made, and I absolutely agree with him on the Chinese contestation of the rules. In fact, I recall the Wendy Sherman, the US Deputy Secretary of State, her recent meeting with Wang Yi at Tianjin. And that's exactly what Wang Yi told the US Deputy Secretary of State, to say, whose rules? These are the US rules. China was not on the table when those rules were being made. So why should we listen to you? And my second point is something perhaps more conceptual, is that ironically, some of the IR rules, rules of the game, if you will, for example, the principle of sovereignty, is itself in conflict with the kinds of rules with the concept of rules-based order, right? Because if you're based on the principle of sovereignty, every state has the right to decide for itself what it wants to do, because it's the sovereign, right? It's the sovereign power in a bounded territory, and it has the in a sense, from a point of view of an international system, it has the authority to decide its political system and its pathway, right? So if you follow the principle of sovereignty, that itself, the rule itself, is in tension with other rules itself, right? So I just want to add that point.
Okay, yeah. I think we are coming to the close of our this interesting discussion. But when I read your book, Benjamin, I had written down here, maybe you and your two brothers in research, Boon and Mingjiang, to sit down and say, okay, so what are the common characteristics of every country claiming exceptionalism? So eliminate others and see what is left. So in China's case, they have one unique thing called century of humiliation. I don't think anybody else will have that. But in the case of America and maybe some of the other bigger countries in Europe, they will say that, yes, historically, China has 5,000 years of history, and you have a written script that is transmitted through these millennia. Therefore, you can always maintain that you have the exception that people like America, after all, is only a few hundred years old. Singapore is only 56 years old. We can never claim exceptionalism on those bases. So what are the, if you can find maybe 5 common principles of exceptionalism claimed by different group of countries with exceptional characteristic, we can have a big debate. But let us maybe give each of you 1 minute to tell us your takeaway. I cannot answer all the, raise all the questions that our colleagues in RSIS and other part of the region and the world have posed, but I thought maybe, we start with Mingjiang and then Tiang Boon, and then as the author of this book, you can have the last word. 1 minute to say what you have expected to answer, but no one have asked that question yet. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yes. Yeah. I really don't have any additional comments to make, but I would just say that Ben's research in this new book will really spark a lot of interests
Yes.
in this new territory research. So I hope participants in this event this afternoon, some of you who are interested in studying transform policy, who are engaging in research, will join these collective efforts. And thank you.
Right. I just want to pick on what a point made by Ambassador about the basis which different countries will see themselves as exceptional. I would think that a common ingredient for seeing themselves as exceptional is success. If a country is successful in certain aspect, maybe military success, economic success, then they would start to think that we are, maybe the politicians themselves will try to create some narrative to say that we are special and we did it against the odds. I'll just leave it as that.
Good one.
Yeah.
Okay, author.
Yeah, thank you.
Ho.
Thank you, EDC, for that very deceptively simple assignment, which I don't think I will take it on. We can leave it to another PhD student to explore that. But all I can say is that we live in a very critical period right now, as PM Lee Hsien Loong spoke about a couple of days ago at the Aspen summit, and clearly great power competition is in the region. It's here to stay, and whether we like it or not, a lot of these ideas about how countries view themselves, I think is going to play much more of a significant role in the coming years. We often say that the idea that globalization has flattened all differences among countries, states, I think that idea is now increasingly seen as being questioned. And now I would say that the big big question is to really ask what are the differences that divide us and to find ways to live with those differences. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I appreciate your interest in this book. I look forward to further discussions online or offline. And have a very good weekend and happy National Day to our Singaporean friends.
Thank you to Mingjiang, Boon, and Benjamin Ho. I wanted to just add 2 lines that for me, China may be exceptional, America may be exceptional, Singapore may be exceptional, but once you have been accepted as exceptional, you are just like any other ordinary power. Yeah. So the important thing that we need to think about is how to sustain the feeling of being exceptional. The tempo of exceptionalism must continue. Yeah. And if everybody in the world think of themselves as having the ability to be exceptional, and those who are already regarded as exceptional can think about how to keep this quality about exceptionalism going, it would be a very, very good, it doesn't necessarily have to be a competitive and contentious work, but it is to motivate people to keep on looking at the future and do something good for the future. So on that note, I think we should wrap up. Yeah, congratulations to you, Benjamin, for this book that made me lose about 3 nights of sleep. Yeah, I wanted to test you about all your famous Chinese IR expert, Yan Xitong, and your friend Mr. Professor Zhao and Professor Tiang, and the other one is who? One more chap that I now forgotten. There are 4 of them. Yeah, we should continue to keep in touch with these people to get a bit more understanding of what they are trying to convey to us about their interpretation of China's exceptionalism, because that is important for us to deal with the international order and global leadership that the Chinese leadership in Beijing feel they should be a part of. Yeah. So thank you all. Yeah. Have a good day. And don't forget to buy Mingjiang's book. Benjamin's book. Yeah. This is to encourage him to write the next book on what are the 5 common ingredients of being exceptional. Thank you all very much, and have a good day.